So this will be my last video on Charles Taylor's The Malaise of Modernity, and today I'm going to talk about some of the stuff that he writes in Chapter 9 and 10. Chapter 9 is entitled An Iron Cage, and Chapter 10 is Against Fragmentation. And in these two chapters, even though he's a Canadian philosopher, I think a lot of his mind is on the country south of Canada, and he does say so explicitly at times, including in the quote that you see there. So what he starts out with, well, a few pages in anyway, in this chapter, An Iron Cage, he points out, I think in a really effective way, how self-contradictory both of the two major American political parties can really be. And by doing that, he kind of points us in the direction of like what actually would be a more reasonable position. So he starts out with these types of observations. So he says, first, right-wing American-style conservatives speak as advocates of traditional communities when they attack abortion on demand and pornography. But in their economic policies, they advocate an untamed form of capitalist enterprise, which more than anything else has helped to dissolve historical communities, has fostered atomism, which is an extreme self-interested individualism, which knows no frontiers or loyalties, and is ready to close down a mining town or savage a forest habitat at the drop of a balance sheet. This is a point similar to that which I try to hammer home again and again on this channel, that this type of conservatism does not conserve, and that people don't, I think because they've so long been bombarded with propaganda, they don't put two and two together. That untrammeled, corporate power, lowering of all regulations, not taxing them enough to pay for the damage that they do in all of this, is anti-traditional community and anti-life. Just contemplate again what he says here. In their economic policies, they advocate an untamed form of capitalist enterprise, which more than anything else has helped to dissolve historical communities, fostered atomism, which knows no frontiers or loyalties, and is ready to close down mining town or savage a forest habitat at the drop of a balance sheet. I think a lot of people have been attracted actually to the new right or, right-wing populism because at a gut level, they sense that historical communities are being dissolved, that there is just a complete sort of like mindless rights mentality, which they themselves have adopted, but only for their particular issues, that frontiers and loyalties, in other words, community, culture is kind of under assault, is being fragmented. They sense this, but at the same time, and maybe without really realizing it, they have been supporting a party whose primary mission for the past few decades has been to allow these things to happen by ceding more and more democratic territory over to just corporate business in particular, small business dying. Okay, the rhetoric is all about small business. The reality is small businesses are being hung out to dry, and that was happening long before the pandemic. But here's the other half of Charles Taylor's statement. He says, on the other side, now this would be the Democrats, we find supporters of an attentive, reverential stance to nature who would go to the wall to defend the forest habitat, but demonstrating in favor of abortion on demand on the grounds that a woman's body belongs exclusively to her. Some adversaries of savage capitalism carry possessive individualism farther than its most untroubled defenders. I put these pictures up here because, the Trump supporters have kind of ironically use the "my body, my choice" slogan for their own purposes. And while that may seem kind of ludicrous, and I don't agree with some of what they're saying, I think that the fact that they've done this demonstrates that this idea that, a person has an absolute right to complete freedom to choose in every possible way because it's their body abstracts from the fact of human relationships, of commitments, of, the value of true community in which people have to regard each other, and the decision that you make affects other people, those you love and those you don't even know. And so it demonstrates that everybody, or a lot of people in our society, are infected with this atomistic, very rights-oriented view that is ultimately extremely corrosive to community and democracy. And Charles Taylor says of them, they are more or less equally wrong. And I love this picture of Taylor because here he looks almost like a, he's like a pro wrestler or something like that. It's like showing his muscle there. So he goes on in this chapter to say we can't see the development of technological society just in the light of the imperative of domination, as left-leaning liberals do, progressives do, and people farther to the left tend to. They see the development of technological society as, domination. I've been kind of a little prone to this, but I understand also that technology in and of itself is not bad. As Taylor argues, technology has a tendency, which Jacques Ellul thought was almost ineluctable, to push towards its extremes and to sort of take over from human agency. And this is the way in which, conservatives tend to view technology. There's no end, there's no limit to what it should do. And more or less we should trust it, maybe especially because a lot of it ultimately is seen as coming from the corporate world, although it almost always got its start on the government side. Taylor points out or argues that technology in and of itself is not bad, and that furthermore, in the Enlightenment, and he references Francis Bacon in particular, but he's referring to Enlightenment thought more generally, that there was at the beginning a human and humane impulse in wanting to rationalize and develop organization and technology to the extent that we could. And the impulse was moral. It was to make things better. And he says knockers and boosters alike have forgotten these richer moral sources. I think knockers and boosters is Canadian speak, but it could just be Charles Taylor speak. But the knockers are people who criticize technological development, and the boosters are like the conservatives or the pro-capitalist people who see no problem with any and all uses of technology, at least until the companies start to censor their speech and things like that. So in other words, critics and friends alike have forgotten these richer moral sources. So part of what he wants to do is recover those richer moral sources to remind people, just like he did with the theme of authenticity, that technical rationality, or technique, as Ellul would put it, originated in a moral impulse, or at least it partly did. And it is that we need to recover so that it does not basically just take over and dehumanize. It's doing the opposite of what it was originally intended, according to Taylor. He talks about some impediments to reasonable change in the direction of getting the works that we have made under our control and of bringing more humanness back into our lives. Scientism is one of the things that he mentions. It's this overwhelming sort of faith and blind acceptance of science. And I would say right now that we're seeing a pushback against that. And it may not be terribly well informed, but maybe the instinct is not totally bad, because science is a method and science is one means of gaining knowledge. It's not equally applicable across all areas of life, and it usually doesn't incorporate moral reasoning, which is necessary coming from the outside or within in order for science not to become harmful. So scientism is this idea that you can apply scientific reasoning to any and everything, and that you should do so pretty uncritically. Instrumental reason, basically like the fragmenting of the work that we do into discrete tasks, fragmenting problems into their discrete parts, okay, is instrumentalism. And over time, this has led, and it goes on in the economy in a big way, right? We've taken the sort of factory production mentality, even though we don't primarily live off of factories anymore in the United States anyway, but we've taken that mentality into pretty much every area of your life. If you can't figure out when and where you're going to get a shot, it's probably because in the attempt to make things so incredibly efficient, we have in fact turned into the Soviet Union in a way, with everybody doing a little bit here and a little bit there, and unfortunately they're not communicating with each other. That fragmentation also applies, maybe politically most crucially, to our culture. We hardly have a public culture anymore, not only in politics but in entertainment, in social media and communication. It's efficient and it's profit-making to do this to people, right? To create camps of people. But it means that you have, in effect, eliminated the public, all right? Because the public, that is, people thinking of themselves as a larger body that needs to deliberate, that needs to see each other as citizens, that isn't really, at least until now, we couldn't see that was sort of economically necessary. In fact, the opposite seemed to be more profitable, splitting and dividing people. Now we're beginning to see that things can come to such a pass that the economy can be disrupted, right, by fragmentation. So, part of what Taylor, this was written long before COVID and all of the latest political stuff going on in the United States. But, part of what he's trying to do is figure out how can you take back from fragmentation? How can you regain some sort of public? Because without the public mentality, you literally can't have an effective democracy. He also, looks at what I would call inevitabilism or capitalist realism. The idea that, not just in capitalism, but in pretty much everything, that what we have is what had to have happened, and that, we really can't go up against it and we can't change it. A sort of fatalistic mentality that he's trying to push back against and say, no, these forces, economic, social, and cultural, are really strong, but we are still free-willing people who can speak and who can reason with each other if we really want to. So he's going to say, they're strong, but we have to insist that we can change our situation if we really want to. He also blames the ideal of freedom poorly understood, especially in the United States. Again, we have this overwhelming idea of freedom as sort of like the founding principle. But when freedom becomes freedom to do any and all things without any regard for your fellow human beings or even your fellow family members, well then, is it freedom? Because that type of freedom creates so much disorder and so much lack of cooperation that literally the free individual can't get done the necessary things to be able to be secure and to actually enjoy his freedom. So it kind of bites itself, when freedom becomes licentiousness, right? Freedom turns into license, the license to do any and all things, and it bites itself, it turns on itself, and it destroys itself. And then he also mentions, and this kind of goes along with instrumentalism, the single principle mentality that's especially operative in politics and maybe particularly on the right now, but generally in our political scene for quite a while. That single principle, the one solution, whatever it might be, the one proposal. I've got the answer, says the politician. Let's implement this one program. And this mentality not only is wrong because problems are way more complex and really intractable, meaning that they can't be completely 100% solved most of the time. They can only be sort of patched up and ameliorated more or less effectively. Not only that, though, but it polarizes people as they get behind a sort of stupid, and I say that advisedly, but like stupid, bandwagon effect, right? Yeah, like I'm the booster for this. I like that now. I'm the booster for this like one idea, which is simple and I can understand it and I can shout it at people and create a ruckus and get a lot of attention for myself and basically act like a child. And I'm not just speaking of people on the right, but on the left as well, definitely. We are like children, especially in the United States right now, but really everywhere. Human beings, I think, are still somehow in their infancy, and like an unruly toddler, they're about ready to destroy the living room of their existence. Okay. Now, Taylor, I guess, foresaw all this, and he's trying at the end of the book to find those roots of, instead of rejecting technological progress and, organizational growth, rejecting it completely, like, can we retrieve the moral and humane roots, and by doing that, maybe begin to assert control over it and over ourselves. One moral ideal that's worth retrieving, he says, is self-responsible, self-controlling reasoning, which he would say we definitely lack. Okay, we think that when we shout "my body, my choice," or like "don't make me wear a mask" or whatever it may be, but we're like lemmings following, I guess, a whole stream of lemmings, right? Or a herd. I'm not even sure what lemmings are and whether they have herds or schools or what, but I think maybe sheep would be a better analogy, right? Think about whether your thoughts are reasoned out by you or whether you're taking your cues and marching orders from like the popular kids or whatever your cultural equivalent of that is. And then he says the moral affirmation of ordinary life is the other retrievable root of, technological progress and social and organizational progress. Originally, it was about, quote, the life of production and reproduction of work and family. And it was about doing the work necessary to relieve human suffering and free human beings up to be better, to be the best they could be, okay? So this all began with the idealism of growing up, right, as a species, growing up as human beings in the Enlightenment, of using reason to rescue humanity from illegitimate domination, suffering, and ignorance. Now, as you know, if you've watched this channel for a while, I'm dubious of the Enlightenment and Enlightenment liberalism in particular, largely because of what's been done with it. And so I'm also somewhat dubious of Taylor's notion that we can somehow retrieve these, because as he even says, the very Enlightenment ideals that we've been talking about strongly tend in the direction of selfishness and fragmentation and dehumanization. And it's a real Herculean task, I think, to reassert control over that and to kind of go against a strong thread within human nature itself of self-interest. And how do you do that? But his ideas resonate with some of the authors that we've covered on the program, and I thought particularly of the channel, I thought particularly of Wendy Brown and Chantal Mouffe, because he talks about in the way of getting back these sort of moral ideals and the sense of human purpose, that he wants a resurgence in meaningful democracy. And he acknowledges that that's not at all an easy ask. He says we can't abolish the market, but nor can we organize ourselves exclusively through markets. To restrict them may be costly. Not to restrict them at all would be fatal. In order to do what it takes to get the market under human control, to get technology under human control, to get bureaucratic organization under human control, politics has been the means for quite some time. Politics is the human art, right? And we aren't practicing it, or we're not practicing it well, according to either one of these authors. Taylor reminds us that democratic politics is never ending, that there is no point where you're going to achieve total victory or be entirely right, and that that's the nature of politics. He says there is no definitive winner or victory. There is winning or losing ground. And I would say particularly Chantal Mouffe agrees with that notion of politics. The zone of freedom for Mouffe is actually in disagreement, in the give and take, and it being more or less unresolvable. But you can, within that zone, make progress and come to fuller agreement and make useful decisions that may be temporary but are still very beneficial to society. And Wendy Brown talks about the undoing of the demos, right? And how neoliberal economics and politics and organization have kind of fragmented the demos, or the democratic polity. She would agree. This is the huge thing that we're confronting now, the huge problem that we have to tackle. Taylor is thinking about the fact that we need a political debate and not a battle. And I think that we, in the media as well as in our politics, have equated the two. A debate is something where you have parties who disagree, but their aim is to achieve better understanding of each other's position and perhaps some agreement, hopefully some agreement, as people are willing to learn from the other side. We need a debate on what technology is for, right? Not technology for its own sake, or technique for its own sake, or economic growth for its own sake, or bureaucratic growth for its own sake, or building buildings for their own sake, right? But rather we need to re-inject into that growth imperative the moral imperative, right? What is this all for? It's supposed to be for us human beings. And of course, this society has put moral reasoning and moral debate over here in this obscure and very shrinking zone of academic discourse, right? And refuses to admit that it is really central to democracy and to freedom itself. We need to get that back. We need to stop shrinking it and paying lip service to it and committing scientism, and get back to understanding that without moral debate and moral understanding, we will be overtaken by our own creations. We need to debate the limits of economic freedom and to balance it with human freedom and the human welfare and good. We need to debate the limits of government power, despite the rhetoric of years and years from Republicans in particular, but both Democrats and Republicans, about wanting to make government more efficient and to shrink it and its influence. It's grown at every level, and it's gotten into areas of our lives that it probably shouldn't. Or if it is in our lives, it should definitely be under closer democratic control at every level. We need to debate the state of our culture and to really hear the concerns of both sides respectfully and realize that they can come from a good place and not just from a place of egotism, which is where they mainly come from right now. Egotism and narcissism. Taylor ends with a suggestion that we need subsidiarity, which is the idea that you devolve to the lowest level, those tasks that can be handled best at that level. So if, for instance, because for the sake of food security and health, food really ought to be produced closer to where it's consumed, then people in an area should be empowered through government to be able to reestablish food security. That's just an example. But it's the idea that democracy can become more powerful if we give more of that power back to people at the local and, provincial or state levels when it is appropriate. And this has to be balanced by tasks that are more appropriate at that larger national level. So we need to have a democratic discussion and debate about what should be allowed at the local level, the provincial and state level, and so on. And particularly how people at those levels can actually have much more control over it. How many of you feel like if you live in a city in the United States or a town, do you feel like you really have any say or control over even what your city government does? But yet this is really where democracy ought to thrive. And I think that, Taylor is saying if people felt as though they had agency through their democratic practices, through votes, but also through actual interaction in the political process with people doing the managing, or the politicians, or maybe doing without so many managers and politicians. If they did feel that, then maybe they wouldn't be so frustrated that they felt their very freedom was under assault, because it wouldn't be. So anyway, those are some last thoughts inspired by Charles Taylor's The Malaise of Modernity. It's a short book. I would say read this book. It's really good. I will be covering a little bit of Alex Blanchette's Porkopolis next. Probably just do maybe 2 or 3 sessions on it. It's a good book. It gets into the ins and outs of the pork industry, and especially its impact on the human beings involved in these massive pork production plants. All right. See you next week. Bye.